Executive Order 14176. Declassification of records concerning the assassinations of President John F. Kennedy, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, and the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Part 4. Suspected involvement and theories. A government and intelligence agencies. CIA. The Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, has long been a source of controversy and suspicion in the aftermath of the assassinations of President John F. Kennedy, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Declassified documents, covert operations, and historical investigations have fueled ongoing conspiracy theories about the CIA's possible involvement or indirect influence in these pivotal moments in American history. The following points will explore key aspects of the CIA's operations during the 1960s and their potential links to these assassinations. 1. Covert operations and surveillance of Lee Harvey Oswald, JFK's assassination. Oswald's Soviet ties. One of the most contentious issues surrounding the JFK assassination was Lee Harvey Oswald's connections to the Soviet Union and Cuba. Oswald defected to the USSR in 1959 and spent time in Minsk before returning to the US in 1962. There have been multiple reports suggesting that the CIA was closely monitoring Oswald's movements and communications during this time, as he was under surveillance as part of the CIA's broader Cold War activities. Oswald's FBI and CIA connections. Documents from the early 1960s show that the CIA and FBI both had knowledge of Oswald's activities, including his pro-Castro leanings. However, some argue that the agencies were slow to act on the intelligence they gathered. This delay in intervention raises questions about whether the CIA actively facilitated Oswald's actions, or whether his surveillance was deliberately ignored or mishandled. Possible CIA complicity or incompetence. The discrepancies in intelligence sharing between the CIA, FBI, and other agencies have led some theorists to speculate that the CIA either played a more direct role in Oswald's actions or allowed him to go unchecked due to internal political motives, including Kennedy's stance on Cuba and Vietnam. 2. The CIA and Robert F. Kennedy's assassination, RFK. Suspicion of CIA involvement in RFK's assassination. After Robert F. Kennedy's assassination in 1968, a number of investigators and conspiracy theorists pointed to possible links between the CIA and Sirhan Sirhan, RFK's alleged assassin. Some documents, particularly the declassified files from the 1970s and 1980s, raised the possibility of CIA interest in RFK's presidential campaign, particularly in relation to his stance on Vietnam and his promises to de-escalate U.S. military involvement. These records were often vague or incomplete, adding to the theory that intelligence agencies may have been concerned with RFK's potential to alter U.S. foreign policy. Possible CIA motives. RFK was a vocal critic of U.S. involvement in Vietnam and Cuba, and his presidency could have led to a significant shift in U.S. foreign policy. This was particularly concerning to the CIA, which had a vested interest in maintaining the status quo regarding the Cold War. Some theorists argue that this geopolitical context may have created a motive for CIA involvement in his assassination, either directly or indirectly. 3. COINTELPRO and the CIA's efforts against Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. COINTELPRO's role. During the 1960s, the CIA, alongside the FBI, conducted a covert program called COINTELPRO, Counterintelligence Program, aimed at surveilling, infiltrating, and disrupting civil rights organizations and activists. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., due to his powerful influence as a leader of the civil rights movement, was a key target of these operations. Attempts to discredit Dr. King. Documents declassified in the 1970s reveal that the FBI and CIA worked together to discredit King, using tactics such as anonymous letters and smear campaigns to undermine his credibility and leadership. They even attempted to pressure him into suicide by sending him a letter in 1964. Warning him of his sinful behavior and suggesting that he would be better off ending his life rather than face disgrace. Links to Dr. King's assassination. Some researchers argue that the CIA's and FBI's efforts against Dr. King contributed to an atmosphere of animosity and tension that may have played a role in the circumstances surrounding his assassination in 1968. While no conclusive evidence has emerged to link the CIA directly to his death, the extensive surveillance and manipulation of his public image remain a significant part of the conversation about possible government involvement in his tragic assassination. FBI. J. Edgar Hoover's role. 1. J. Edgar Hoover's hostility toward Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. COINTELPRO and Milk. Hoover's FBI viewed Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as a threat due to his leadership in the civil rights movement. The FBI began an extensive covert program called COINTELPRO, Counterintelligence Program, which was aimed at surveilling, discrediting, and disrupting groups that were seen as subversive to U.S. interests. Dr. King was a primary target of COINTELPRO, and the FBI worked to undermine his reputation and credibility. Surveillance and smear campaigns. Hoover and the FBI's efforts to monitor Dr. King were extensive. They placed him under surveillance and tried to discredit him through public smear campaigns. Hoover was particularly opposed to King's opposition to the Vietnam War and his growing influence in pushing for radical changes in U.S. society. The FBI's actions went so far as to send Dr. King a letter in 1964, urging him to commit suicide as part of a harassment campaign meant to destabilize his leadership. FBI's involvement in Dr. King's assassination. While there is no direct evidence connecting Hoover or the FBI to Dr. King's assassination, their efforts to discredit him set the stage for a climate of hostility and public distrust. These actions may have contributed to the environment of tension leading up to his tragic death in 1968. Some theorists argue that Hoover's animosity toward King could have led to indirect involvement, either in a failure to protect King or in pushing for an atmosphere that allowed his assassination to happen. Hoover's handling of JFK's assassination. FBI's initial investigation of JFK's assassination. In the wake of President John F. Kennedy's assassination in November 1963, Hoover's FBI was tasked with investigating the crime. Hoover personally took charge of the investigation and immediately promoted the lone gunman theory, insisting that Lee Harvey Oswald was the sole assassin, despite numerous inconsistencies and the lack of conclusive evidence. Suppression of evidence and the Warren Commission. Many critics have accused Hoover of suppressing or manipulating evidence during the investigation into JFK's assassination. Documents suggest that the FBI did not fully cooperate with other agencies or with the Warren Commission, which was established to investigate the assassination. Hoover's refusal to consider conspiracy theories, even when mounting evidence suggested possible involvement by other parties, has led many to question whether the FBI intentionally downplayed or ignored vital leads in the investigation. Hoover's public influence. Hoover's personal political agenda also influenced the way the investigation was conducted. JFK had previously expressed concerns about Hoover's overreach and his handling of intelligence, particularly in relation to civil rights activists and suspected communist sympathizers. Hoover's ability to influence the narrative around JFK's death and his control over information led to suspicions that the FBI might have been involved in a cover-up of potential conspiracy elements in the assassination. 3. Hoover's involvement in RFK's assassination. J. Edgar Hoover and RFK's tensions. RFK, like his brother JFK, had a complicated relationship with Hoover. As Attorney General, RFK was responsible for overseeing the FBI, and tensions arose between him and Hoover over issues like the FBI's investigation of civil rights leaders and the FBI's surveillance programs. There is speculation that Hoover's personal animosity toward RFK may have played a role in the way the FBI handled the investigation into his assassination. Suppression of evidence in RFK's case. Much like the handling of JFK's assassination, Hoover's FBI was accused of suppressing or mishandling evidence in the wake of RFK's murder. Many critics believe that there were inconsistencies in the investigation and that potential leads pointing to larger conspiracies were ignored. The FBI's reluctance to entertain alternative theories surrounding RFK's assassination has led to doubts about the thoroughness of the investigation. 4. The FBI's legacy of suppression and manipulation of evidence. The FBI's role in creating a lone gunman narrative. Across all 3 assassinations, JFK, RFK, and Dr. King, the FBI was instrumental in promoting the lone gunman theory, which continues to be heavily scrutinized by conspiracy theorists. Documents suggest that Hoover and the FBI worked to suppress any evidence or theories that might point to a broader conspiracy, even when those theories were based on credible eyewitness accounts or forensic evidence. The impact of Hoover's leadership. Hoover's tenure at the FBI and his influence over American politics has left a legacy of mistrust. His actions during the investigations into these key assassinations raise serious questions about the integrity of the FBI's investigations. Many historians and legal scholars argue that Hoover's personal biases and political motivations may have hindered the pursuit of justice, leaving unanswered questions about the true circumstances surrounding the deaths of these prominent leaders. Military-industrial complex. The military-industrial complex, possible motives behind JFK's policies on Vietnam, Cuba, and the Cold War. Introduction to the military-industrial complex. The term military-industrial complex refers to the close relationship between a country's military, its defense contractors, and the political decision-makers who control them. In the United States, the phrase gained prominence after President Dwight D. Eisenhower's farewell address in 1961, where he warned of the undue influence that this complex could have over national policy. By the time of President John F. Kennedy's administration, the military-industrial complex was a powerful force with significant influence over the direction of U.S. foreign policy, particularly regarding the Cold War, Vietnam, and Cuba. Some theories suggest that JFK's policies on these issues conflicted with the interests of defense contractors, military leaders, and intelligence agencies, possibly providing a motive for those who might have seen his assassination as necessary to preserve their own interests. 1. JFK's policy on Vietnam and the military-industrial complex. Escalation versus de-escalation. Kennedy's policy on Vietnam initially involved limited support to the South Vietnamese government in its struggle against the communist insurgency. However, by the early 1960s, there were mounting pressures from military and intelligence circles to take a more aggressive stance. The Pentagon, backed by defense contractors with stakes in military production and the expansion of the war, was in favor of increased U.S. involvement in Vietnam. JFK's resistance to full escalation. Evidence suggests that JFK was reluctant to escalate the U.S. military presence in Vietnam. He was reportedly concerned about the long-term implications of U.S. involvement, especially after the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Cuban Missile Crisis, both of which reflected poorly on his presidency. JFK even hinted at plans to withdraw American military advisors from Vietnam, which some argue could have significantly affected the profits and influence of defense contractors and military leaders who benefited from the ongoing conflict. Theories of a military-industrial reaction. Some conspiracy theorists believe that the military-industrial complex saw JFK's intentions to withdraw from Vietnam as a threat to their economic and strategic interests. This could have been a key motive for those who wanted to see Kennedy removed from office. After Kennedy's assassination, his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, quickly escalated the Vietnam War, leading to a massive increase in military spending and profits for defense contractors. 2. JFK and Cuba, the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Bay of Pigs invasion, 1961. One of the most controversial moments in JFK's early presidency was the failed CIA-led invasion of Cuba in April 1961. The mission aimed to overthrow Cuban leader Fidel Castro, a communist who had established strong ties with the Soviet Union. The invasion failed miserably, causing significant embarrassment for the U.S. government and tarnishing JFK's image. It is widely believed that the military-industrial complex and defense contractors had an interest in regime change in Cuba, as this would open up lucrative opportunities for military engagements and contracts. Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought the U.S. to the brink of nuclear war with the Soviet Union, and it represented a critical moment in JFK's foreign policy. Some believe that the military-industrial complex was pushing for more aggressive action against Cuba and the Soviet Union during the crisis, but JFK resisted their pressure and instead opted for a diplomatic solution. His decision to negotiate rather than escalate the conflict may have caused friction with military leaders, defense contractors, and certain elements within the intelligence community, who may have viewed diplomacy as a sign of weakness. Theories of discontent. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, JFK made it clear that he wanted to reduce tensions with the Soviet Union and pursue a path of diplomacy. This move, while celebrated by many, was seen as problematic by the military-industrial complex, which thrived on the continuation of the Cold War. The notion that Kennedy was too soft on communism and was veering away from military solutions is thought to have led to dissent among powerful military and corporate figures who preferred a more aggressive stance. 3. JFK and the Cold War, confrontation with the Soviet Union. Kennedy's Cold War strategy. JFK's Cold War strategy was defined by the idea of flexible response, which was intended to provide the U.S. with multiple options in dealing with the Soviet Union. Kennedy's approach was cautious and aimed at containing communism through non-nuclear means, such as supporting insurgents or regime changes, rather than relying on nuclear retaliation. Military-industrial influence on Cold War policy. The military-industrial complex, which profited from the Cold War arms race, pushed for continued escalation in military spending and technological advancements, particularly the development of nuclear weapons. JFK's commitment to containing the Soviet Union was crucial, but some argue that the military-industrial complex sought more aggressive policies, especially during moments like the Berlin Crisis and the Cuban Missile Crisis. The reluctance to engage in an all-out nuclear confrontation with the Soviet Union, coupled with JFK's desire to pursue diplomacy, may have been seen as detrimental to the interests of defense contractors who profited from military buildup. 4 theories of assassination motivated by the military-industrial complex. Conflict over war profits. The escalation of the Vietnam War and the arms race with the Soviet Union was a gold mine for military contractors, as each escalation provided new opportunities for weapons contracts, military equipment, and supplies. Theories suggest that JFK's reluctance to fully commit to war in Vietnam and his diplomatic approach to the Soviet Union and Cuba posed a threat to the profits and strategic dominance of the military-industrial complex. The assassination of JFK as a preventive measure. Some conspiracy theorists argue that the assassination of JFK was orchestrated by those with a vested interest in war and military expansion. They speculate that powerful figures within the Pentagon, the defense industry, or even intelligence agencies may have seen JFK as an obstacle to their interests, particularly regarding his policies toward Vietnam and Cuba. Following his assassination, the U.S. quickly escalated its involvement in Vietnam under President Lyndon B. Johnson, a move that was welcomed by the military-industrial complex. 5. The legacy of the military-industrial complex in the aftermath of JFK's assassination. The expansion of U.S. military engagements. After JFK's assassination, the escalation of the Vietnam War under LBJ marked a dramatic increase in U.S. military engagement in Southeast Asia, which also led to a massive increase in military spending. The Vietnam War, along with the Cold War arms race, provided long-term benefits to the defense contractors and military suppliers that had close ties to the government. Continued influence. The influence of the military-industrial complex did not end with JFK's assassination but continued to shape U.S. foreign policy for decades. Subsequent administrations, including those of Lyndon B. Johnson, Richard Nixon, and Ronald Reagan, oversaw continued military interventions and defense spending, in many cases benefiting from the support of defense contractors, weapons manufacturers, and military officials. Organized crime and the Mafia. Introduction to the Mafia's relationship with the Kennedys. The Kennedy family, particularly President John F. Kennedy, JFK, and his brother, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, RFK, were publicly known for their strong stance against organized crime. This approach, while lauded by many, made them enemies of powerful figures within the Mafia, who felt threatened by the Kennedys' aggressive law enforcement measures. As FBI documents and historical evidence have suggested, the Mafia harbored deep resentment toward the Kennedys, particularly Robert F. Kennedy's efforts to dismantle organized crime syndicates in the United States. Some conspiracy theories propose that this tension played a significant role in the assassinations of both JFK and RFK, with the Mafia possibly seeking revenge for the crackdown on their illicit operations. 1. RFK's crackdown on organized crime. RFK's appointment as Attorney General. When John F. Kennedy became president in 1961, he appointed his younger brother, Robert F. Kennedy, as Attorney General. RFK wasted no time in directing the full force of the U.S. Justice Department against organized crime, focusing particularly on Mafia figures who had long operated with impunity. His efforts were not only aggressive but personal, as he viewed organized crime as a direct threat to American values and democracy. Key actions against the Mafia. Under RFK's leadership, the Justice Department launched a comprehensive and unrelenting campaign against organized crime. The FBI, under the direction of J. Edgar Hoover, ramped up its surveillance of Mafia figures, and RFK personally oversaw numerous investigations and prosecutions. Some of the key targets included notorious Mafia bosses such as Sam Giancana, Carlo Gambino, and Johnny Rosselli, who were deeply entrenched in illicit activities ranging from drug trafficking to labor racketeering and political corruption. RFK's personal vendetta. RFK's approach to fighting organized crime was seen as especially personal. He was deeply committed to bringing down the Mafia, and many of his actions as Attorney General reflected this determination. However, his focus on disrupting the mafia's operations and prosecuting its leaders likely made him a significant target of mafia retaliation. Documents from the FBI and other sources suggest that some mafia figures viewed RFK's aggressive stance as a betrayal, particularly since his father, Joseph Kennedy, had reportedly had business dealings with some mafia figures in the past. 2. Mafia's possible motive for revenge. The mafia's response to RFK's actions. The mafia was not blind to RFK's efforts. Many believed that his crackdown was fueled not only by the desire to enforce the law but also by a personal vendetta against those who had previously aided or been associated with his family. The mafia, a highly secretive and vindictive organization, could have viewed RFK's actions as a direct affront to their power and livelihood. The assassination of JFK. The theory of mafia involvement in the assassination of JFK stems from the idea that the mafia sought revenge against both the Kennedy brothers. Several key factors contribute to this theory. JFK's alleged dealings with the mafia. Some conspiracy theorists suggest that the Kennedys had earlier dealings with mafia figures, particularly during the 1960 presidential campaign. JFK allegedly received support from the mafia in the form of votes and assistance from figures like Giancana and Rosselli to secure his election victory. In return, some claim that the mafia expected favorable treatment, especially in the realm of anti-racketeering law enforcement. However, JFK's administration did not honor these unspoken deals, particularly as RFK took a hardline stance against organized crime. JFK's failure to deliver on mafia expectations. As president, JFK's administration began to target mafia figures, even though there were unsubstantiated claims of mafia involvement in getting him elected. The Kennedys' crackdown on organized crime left mafia figures frustrated, and some believe this frustration may have contributed to a motive for revenge. Possible mafia involvement in JFK's assassination. According to various conspiracy theories, the mafia may have been involved in JFK's assassination as a form of retaliation for the Attorney General's relentless pursuit of their criminal enterprises. Documents and testimonies from individuals connected to the mafia suggest that key figures like Sam Giancana and Johnny Rosselli may have had a direct interest in eliminating Kennedy as a threat. The theory claims that the mafia could have orchestrated the assassination in cooperation with other interested parties, possibly including rogue elements of the CIA, to ensure the Kennedy brothers were silenced once and for all. 3. FBI documents and mafia connections. The FBI's role in investigating the mafia. Throughout the early 1960s, the FBI collected extensive intelligence on mafia activities and the figures behind them, including Giancana, Gambino, and Rosselli, all of whom had ties to organized crime syndicates across the U.S. and internationally. The FBI files on these individuals, some of which were declassified over the years, provide insight into the extent of the surveillance and the growing tension between the government and the mafia. These documents suggest that the mafia was aware of the Kennedy administration's efforts to bring them to justice and took note of the increasing threat posed by RFK's initiatives. FBI's investigation into possible mafia involvement in JFK's assassination. After the assassination of President Kennedy, FBI files show that agents pursued leads that pointed to potential mafia involvement. Investigations into possible mafia links were underway, but these were complicated by political pressures, and evidence pointing to mafia involvement was often dismissed or downplayed by authorities. In later years, some declassified documents suggest that the FBI was aware of the mafia's potential motive but chose not to fully pursue these leads. 4. RFK's assassination and the continuing theory of mafia revenge. RFK's assassination in 1968, less than 5 years after JFK's assassination, Robert F. Kennedy was shot and killed during his campaign for the presidency. While the official narrative blames Sirhan Sirhan, a Palestinian Arab, for the murder, conspiracy theories have suggested that the mafia may have been involved in the assassination, possibly as an act of revenge for RFK's continued efforts to dismantle organized crime. Possible mafia connections to RFK's assassination. Similar to the theory surrounding JFK's death, some believe that the mafia may have felt threatened by RFK's growing popularity and his potential to become president. If he had succeeded in his campaign, RFK would have likely continued his efforts against organized crime, which could have posed a direct threat to the mafia's operations. Some conspiracy theorists claim that the mafia orchestrated RFK's assassination as a final act of retribution for the damage caused by his earlier crackdown on their activities. Jack Ruby's mafia ties. The Man Who Killed Oswald. Introduction. Jack Ruby, the nightclub owner who fatally shot Lee Harvey Oswald on November 24, 1963, just 2 days after Oswald's arrest for the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, remains one of the most enigmatic figures in the aftermath of JFK's death. Ruby's actions, in which he killed Oswald while he was being transferred to a county jail, raised immediate suspicions and conspiracy theories. His connections to organized crime, specifically the Mafia, have been a focal point of those theories, suggesting that Ruby's actions may have been orchestrated by Mafia figures seeking to silence Oswald before he could reveal crucial information about the assassination. 1. Jack Ruby's background. Early life and entry into the nightlife industry. Jack Ruby was born in 1911 and raised in Chicago, Illinois, before moving to Dallas, Texas, in the late 1940s. Ruby quickly immersed himself in the city's nightlife scene, operating a series of nightclubs, strip clubs, and bars. His establishments were often frequented by a range of individuals, including law enforcement, local businessmen, and criminal figures. As Ruby's business ventures grew, so did his associations with various underworld figures, leading to speculation about his possible connections to the Mafia. Ruby's reputation and associations. Ruby was known for his loud, brash personality and frequent interaction with local law enforcement, but more notably, he had ties to individuals with connections to organized crime. He was known to have dealings with individuals tied to the Mafia in Dallas, as well as connections to crime syndicates operating out of Chicago and New York. These associations have been at the center of many conspiracy theories suggesting that Ruby's actions in killing Oswald may have been part of a larger plot involving organized crime. 2. Ruby's Mafia connections. Associations with Dallas criminal figures. Ruby's ties to the Mafia are most often linked to his interactions with criminal figures based in Dallas. For example, he had known connections to Joe Campisi, a prominent Dallas Mafia figure who was involved in illegal gambling and other rackets. Campisi was associated with the Chicago Outfit, a powerful Mafia group based in the Windy City, which had a strong influence on criminal activities across the United States. Ruby's links to Chicago Mafia bosses. Ruby's connections with organized crime figures in Chicago are also significant. Sam Giancana, the infamous boss of the Chicago Outfit, was rumored to have ties to Ruby. Giancana and his associates were deeply involved in various illicit activities, including gambling, narcotics, and other rackets. Ruby's potential ties to such figures have led to suspicions that he may have been used as a pawn by Mafia interests seeking to eliminate Oswald before he could implicate anyone else in the assassination. The Mafia's motive for Oswald's silence. The theory of Ruby as a Mafia operative suggests that Oswald, having been arrested for JFK's assassination, could have had crucial information about the involvement of others in the plot. Some speculate that Oswald may have known about the Mafia's possible role in the assassination, and in the eyes of organized crime, it was crucial that he not be allowed to testify or reveal what he knew. Ruby's action in killing Oswald could have been seen as a way to silence a potential threat to the Mafia's interests and prevent further investigation into the true culprits behind the assassination. 3. Ruby's motive for killing Oswald. Ruby's own testimony and public statements. In interviews following Oswald's death, Jack Ruby claimed that he was simply acting out of emotional distress. He stated that he wanted to spare Jacqueline Kennedy from the pain of a trial, explaining his actions as an impromptu act of sympathy. However, this explanation has been met with skepticism, particularly considering Ruby's connections to the criminal underworld and the timing of the shooting. His sudden, premeditated action to kill Oswald while he was under tight security and in police custody has led many to believe that his motives may have been more complex than a simple emotional outburst. Ruby's behavior and inconsistencies. Ruby's behavior in the days leading up to Oswald's death was also peculiar. Several individuals reported seeing Ruby at the scene of Oswald's arrest, and it has been suggested that Ruby had prior knowledge of the time and place of Oswald's transfer. This raises the question of whether Ruby was acting alone or whether he was in communication with other individuals or organizations. 4. Investigations and inconclusive findings. Warren Commission findings. The official investigation into the assassination of JFK, conducted by the Warren Commission, concluded that Jack Ruby acted alone in killing Lee Harvey Oswald, and no direct evidence linked him to a larger conspiracy. However, the Commission's findings have been criticized by those who believe that Ruby's ties to organized crime were not fully investigated or disclosed. Ruby's connections to the Mafia were briefly mentioned in the Commission's report, but they were not given significant attention, leading to suspicions that the investigation was incomplete. Later investigations and conspiracy theories. In the years following the Warren Commission's report, numerous conspiracy theories have emerged, suggesting that Ruby was part of a larger plot involving organized crime, government agencies, or other groups. These theories point to Ruby's known connections to criminal figures and his suspicious behavior before and after the killing of Oswald. Many believe that Ruby was not acting alone and that his actions were orchestrated as part of a plan to silence Oswald permanently. Ruby's death and alleged cover-up. Ruby's own death in 1967, he died of cancer while serving a prison sentence, has also fueled conspiracy theories. Some believe that Ruby's death was not just a natural occurrence but part of a cover-up to prevent him from revealing any further information about the assassination or his possible involvement with Mafia figures. His mysterious death shortly after he was convicted has led some to speculate that he was silenced to prevent him from implicating powerful people or organizations in the conspiracy. See anti-Castro Cuban groups. JFK's failed Bay of Pigs invasion and hostility from Cuban exiles. 1. The Bay of Pigs invasion. Background: the Bay of Pigs invasion, which took place in April 1961, was one of the most significant and controversial episodes of John F. Kennedy's presidency. It was an attempt by the U.S. government to overthrow Fidel Castro's communist regime in Cuba. The invasion was planned by the CIA, which recruited and trained Cuban exiles to carry out the operation. The invasion plan. The plan was to land around 1,400 Cuban exiles at the Bay of Pigs on the southern coast of Cuba, where they would establish a foothold, rally support from the Cuban population, and eventually overthrow Castro's government. The CIA had hoped that the invasion would trigger a popular uprising among Cubans against Castro's regime. The failure. The operation turned into a disaster for the U.S. and the Cuban exiles involved. Poor planning, lack of proper air support, and a failure to anticipate Castro's military response led to the invasion's failure. Within 3 days, the invading force was defeated, and many of the Cuban exiles were captured or killed. The U.S. government's involvement became publicly known, severely embarrassing the Kennedy administration. 2. Hostility from Cuban exiles. Initial reactions. The failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion was a severe blow to the Cuban exile community that had been promised a quick victory and support from the U.S. government. Many Cuban exiles had placed their faith in the CIA and the Kennedy administration, believing that they could help rid Cuba of Castro's communist rule. However, when the invasion failed, many of these exiles felt betrayed and abandoned by the U.S. government. Frustration and anger. The aftermath of the Bay of Pigs invasion created deep resentment among Cuban exiles toward President Kennedy and his administration. These individuals, many of whom had lost friends and family members in the failed operation, blamed the Kennedy administration for the failure and the loss of lives. Some Cuban exile groups, particularly those aligned with the more extreme anti-Castro factions, became increasingly hostile toward Kennedy. There were reports of attempts to undermine Kennedy and even calls for his removal from office. A shift in the exile community's relationship with the U.S., the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion set the stage for a deepening divide between the U.S. government and some Cuban exile groups. While some exiles continued to push for American intervention, others began to view the U.S. as unreliable and criticized Kennedy's handling of the crisis. This shift in sentiment, fueled by anger over the failure, would have long-lasting effects on the relationship between Cuban exiles and the U.S. government throughout the 1960s. 3. Suspected CIA involvement with Cuban exile militias. Cuban exiles and CIA training. CIA's role in the Bay of Pigs. The CIA's involvement in the Bay of Pigs invasion was significant and highly secretive. In the years prior to the invasion, the CIA had worked closely with Cuban exile militias, training and equipping them in preparation for a military operation aimed at overthrowing Fidel Castro's government. The exiles were trained in various locations, including Florida and Nicaragua, under the guise of a covert operation. Many of the exiles involved had been involved in guerrilla activities against Castro's government after the Cuban Revolution in 1959. Training programs. These Cuban exile militias were trained in tactics of insurgency, sabotage, and combat. The CIA also provided the exiles with military equipment, including light arms, vehicles, and boats, which they would need to carry out their mission. However, The lack of proper planning, logistical support, and strategic foresight led to the failure of the operation. The role of the CIA in equipping and directing the Cuban exiles raised concerns about the agency's oversight and whether they were truly prepared for the task. B. Suspicions of continued CIA support for Cuban exiles. Aftermath of the invasion. Following the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion, several Cuban exile groups that had participated in the operation reportedly became increasingly disillusioned with the U.S. government. Some individuals believed that the CIA had secretly continued to work with various Cuban exile groups, including those with more extreme anti-Castro sentiments, even after the failure of the invasion. These groups reportedly sought revenge for their failure and to continue their mission to topple Castro. Theories of CIA's continuing involvement. Some conspiracy theories suggest that the CIA maintained covert support for Cuban exile militias in the years after the Bay of Pigs. There are suspicions that these militias may have been involved in covert operations or plots against Castro, including assassination attempts, sabotage, and smuggling operations. These speculations are largely based on the belief that the CIA had not abandoned its efforts to overthrow Castro, despite the public failure of the Bay of Pigs. See links to the assassinations of JFK, RFK, and others. Connection to JFK's assassination. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion, along with the CIA's close association with Cuban exile militias, has led to suspicions of possible connections to the assassination of President Kennedy. Some conspiracy theorists argue that the Cuban exile community, angered by Kennedy's abandonment of their cause, may have had a motive to kill JFK. These theories suggest that certain factions of the Cuban exile community, possibly supported by elements of the CIA or other U.S. agencies, may have been involved in plotting Kennedy's assassination. Links to RFK's assassination. Similarly, the anger and frustration within the Cuban exile community also extended to Robert F. Kennedy, especially after his crackdown on organized crime and his involvement in the administration's policies toward Cuba. RFK was particularly vocal in his opposition to the mafia's influence and had supported efforts to enforce anti-Castro policies. This further fueled suspicions of potential involvement from the Cuban exile community in his assassination in 1968. Mafia and Cuban exiles. There are additional theories suggesting that elements of the mafia, which had long-standing interests in Cuba prior to Castro's revolution, may have coordinated with Cuban exile militias and the CIA in seeking retribution against the Kennedy administration for its policies and its failure to support anti-Castro efforts. These connections, often tied to organized crime, became a central feature of conspiracy theories surrounding the deaths of both JFK and RFK. D. Lone gunman or coordinated conspiracy. Lee Harvey Oswald, patsy or trained assassin. Background. The assassination of JFK, 1963. Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested for the assassination of President John F. Kennedy on November 22, 1963, in Dallas, Texas. Oswald was accused of shooting JFK from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. He was arrested shortly after the shooting, but before he could stand trial, he was shot and killed by Jack Ruby, a nightclub owner, in front of police officers at the Dallas Police Headquarters. Patsy or trained assassin. The official story. The Warren Commission concluded that Oswald acted alone, firing 3 shots at JFK from the book depository. The theory that Oswald was a lone gunman has been widely accepted by the official government narrative, though many questions about his motives and background remain unanswered. Suspicions of a patsy. Some theories suggest that Oswald may have been framed for the assassination. Oswald had a history of defection to the Soviet Union and was an avowed Marxist, which some believe made him a convenient scapegoat for those seeking to place blame on a lone, mentally unstable individual. His lack of a clear motive and mysterious circumstances surrounding his background have led to claims that he may have been manipulated by powerful forces to take the fall for the assassination. Trained assassin theory. Another theory posits that Oswald was a trained assassin, possibly working under the direction of U.S. intelligence agencies, or as part of a larger conspiracy. Some have pointed to his military background, including his service in the U.S. Marines, where he received sniper training. His alleged ties to Cuba, Russia, and anti-Castro groups further fuel the speculation that Oswald might have been a skilled operative, whether by choice or coercion. Unanswered questions. The mystery surrounding Oswald's connections to other individuals and organizations, including his potential associations with the CIA and the Mafia, raises the question of whether he was truly acting alone. His death at the hands of Jack Ruby, who had connections to organized crime, has only fueled conspiracy theories surrounding the idea that Oswald was silenced to prevent the truth from coming out. Sirhan, mind control, political motive, or scapegoat. Background: the assassination of RFK, 1968. Sirhan was convicted of assassinating Senator Robert F. Kennedy on June 5, 1968, shortly after RFK gave a victory speech following his win in the California Democratic primary. Sirhan shot Kennedy at close range in the kitchen pantry of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. Kennedy succumbed to his injuries a day later. Mind control theory. The mind control theory, one of the most debated theories about Sirhan's motives, is the idea that he was under some form of mind control. Sirhan himself has claimed that he does not remember the events surrounding the assassination, which has led some to believe that he was manipulated by others, potentially through psychological conditioning, hypnosis, or even drugs. Possible CIA connection. Some conspiracy theorists have suggested that Sirhan might have been influenced or controlled as part of a broader government or intelligence agency operation, possibly in relation to MKUltra, a CIA mind control program. The fact that Sirhan's behavior seemed erratic and his inability to recall the shooting led some to hypothesize that he may have been an unwitting pawn in a larger conspiracy. Political motive. Personal motive versus political agenda. Sirhan had a well-known personal animosity toward RFK, largely due to Kennedy's pro-Israel stance. Sirhan was of Palestinian descent, and he reportedly believed that Kennedy's policies in the Middle East, particularly his support for Israel, had led to the suffering of the Palestinian people. This personal vendetta against RFK could have provided a direct motive for the assassination. Questioning the lone gunman theory, some have questioned whether Sirhan acted alone, pointing to evidence that there may have been more than one gunman involved in the shooting. Several witnesses claimed to have heard more than 8 shots fired, while Sirhan's gun could only hold 8 rounds. Some have speculated that Sirhan might have been part of a larger plot, and that others were involved but never brought to justice. James Earl Ray, lone gunman or someone else behind Milk's murder. Background: the assassination of Milk, 1968. James Earl Ray was arrested and convicted for the assassination of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on April 4, 1968, in Memphis, Tennessee. King was shot while standing on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. Ray had a history of criminal activity, and he was quickly identified as the prime suspect after the shooting. The lone gunman theory. Official story: Ray was apprehended in London, where he had fled after the assassination. He was extradited to the US and later pled guilty to the murder of Milk, receiving a 99-year prison sentence. The official government narrative asserts that Ray acted alone, using a rifle to shoot King from a bathroom window across the street from the motel. Questioning the lone gunman theory. Over the years, there have been numerous questions raised about Ray's role in the assassination. Some believe that Ray might have been a convenient scapegoat, with others being responsible for the actual murder. Ray's legal team consistently argued that he was not the true assassin, and his defense claimed that he was part of a larger conspiracy involving multiple actors. Suspected conspiracy. Possible government involvement. A major element of the conspiracy theories surrounding Milk's assassination is the involvement of government agencies or organizations with an interest in silencing King due to his growing influence and his opposition to the Vietnam War and government policies. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, was known to have monitored King and tried to discredit him, suggesting that some elements within the government might have had a vested interest in his death. The Mafia's potential role. Some conspiracy theorists have posited that the Mafia may have been involved in Milk's assassination, potentially in collaboration with government agencies. King's increasing prominence and calls for social justice may have angered powerful factions, who saw him as a threat to their status quo. The King family's view. In a 1999 civil trial, the King family won a wrongful death lawsuit against the U.S. government, with the jury concluding that there was a conspiracy behind the assassination of Dr. King. The family has long maintained that James Earl Ray was not the sole individual behind King's murder. 3 new revelations from Executive Order 14176. What the newly declassified documents reveal about possible conspirators. The release of documents under Executive Order 14176, which declassified records related to the assassinations of President John F. Kennedy, JFK, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, RFK, and Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., MILK, has provided new insight into the events surrounding these pivotal moments in American history. However, despite the declassification, many questions still linger about who may have been involved in these tragedies beyond the official suspects. Here's what the newly declassified documents reveal and what they suggest about possible conspirators. 1. Intelligence agencies' involvement, CIA, FBI. The documents reveal that both the CIA and FBI had extensive files on the individuals involved in the assassinations, including detailed surveillance reports, wiretaps, and potential connections to organized crime. CIA and Cuba connections. The CIA's role in JFK's assassination has been a subject of speculation for years. New records suggest that the CIA had been monitoring Lee Harvey Oswald in Mexico, where he visited the Cuban and Soviet embassies shortly before the assassination. This connection raises the possibility that Oswald's actions might have been influenced by CIA operations related to Cuba and the Cold War. FBI's hostility toward MILK. The declassified documents also shed light on J. Edgar Hoover's FBI and its active efforts to discredit and neutralize Martin Luther King Jr. Hoover's personal disdain for King led the FBI to surveil him extensively, attempt to undermine his credibility, and even send threatening letters to King. While no direct evidence links the FBI to MILK's assassination, these efforts suggest the agency's hostile stance toward King and its possible involvement in broader covert activities. 2. Possible mafia involvement in the JFK and RFK assassinations. Another significant revelation in the newly declassified documents involves the mafia's possible role in the assassinations of both JFK and RFK. JFK's connection to the mafia. The documents show that Jack Ruby, the man who killed Lee Harvey Oswald, had connections to organized crime, including the mafia. Ruby's ties to Santo Trafficante and Meyer Lansky have been well documented. These revelations fuel the theory that the mafia may have had a vested interest in JFK's death, especially after his administration's crackdown on organized crime through his brother Robert F. Kennedy, then the Attorney General. RFK's crackdown on the mafia. The declassified records also highlight RFK's relentless pursuit of mafia figures during his tenure as Attorney General, which made him a target for organized crime. In particular, his actions to imprison mafia bosses and break up criminal syndicates raised suspicion that the mafia might have sought revenge by orchestrating his assassination. 3. Potential governmental conspiracies. In addition to the mafia and intelligence agencies, the declassified documents also raise questions about the role of government officials and agencies in possible conspiracies to cover up or misdirect investigations into the assassinations. Military-industrial complex and Vietnam. The documents suggest that JFK's policy decisions on Vietnam and Cuba might have made him enemies within the military-industrial complex, those with a vested interest in maintaining aggressive foreign policies. Some theorists believe that JFK's perceived unwillingness to escalate the Vietnam War and his push for peace with Cuba could have made him a target for military contractors, CIA operatives, or other factions with opposing interests. RFK's pursuit of justice. As RFK sought justice for his brother's assassination and made significant strides toward civil rights reform, some declassified records point to political factions within the government that were threatened by his influence. His pursuit of power, particularly in the 1968 presidential election, might have made him a target of groups opposed to his policies. What remains hidden? Redacted sections, missing files, potential cover UPS. While the newly declassified documents provide valuable insight, there remain significant gaps in the historical record, particularly in the form of redacted sections, missing files, and potential cover UPS. These gaps raise the question of what the government may still be hiding regarding the circumstances surrounding these iconic assassinations. 1. Redacted sections and missing information. Classified documents and ongoing secrecy. Despite the mass declassification under Executive Order 14176, certain documents related to the assassinations still contain substantial redactions. Some files are almost entirely blacked out, especially those pertaining to sensitive intelligence, covert operations, or the involvement of foreign entities. The declassified documents sometimes only offer partial information or vague references to classified activities. Unreleased intelligence. Many of the redacted files specifically concern CIA surveillance on Oswald and RFK's campaign, including interactions with foreign intelligence agencies. It remains unclear whether CIA operatives or other intelligence agencies were directly involved in the orchestration of these assassinations, as vital documents still remain classified. 2. Potential cover UPS and missing files. The role of the military-industrial complex, the declassification of records has revealed significant government concern over JFK's foreign policy positions, particularly those related to the Cuban Missile Crisis and his attempts to shift U.S. policy away from aggressive war-making. However, there is no direct evidence in the declassified documents tying powerful military-industrial figures to the actual assassination of JFK. It is possible that these figures, if involved, remain obscured by missing or redacted files. Oswald's true ties. While new documents shed light on Lee Harvey Oswald's potential connections to the CIA, the FBI, and organized crime, there are still many unanswered questions about his activities in the months leading up to JFK's assassination. Missing files related to his interactions with Cuban exiles, Soviet agents, and American intelligence remain sealed, preventing a full understanding of the extent of his connections. Ruby and the Mafia. The full extent of Jack Ruby's connections to organized crime and whether he was acting under orders remains uncertain. Many files regarding Ruby's interactions with Mafia figures and his motivations for killing Oswald are still withheld, leaving room for continued speculation about the true motives behind his actions. 3. The impact of ongoing secrecy. The continuing secrecy around certain aspects of the JFK, RFK, and Milk assassinations serves to deepen the mystery surrounding these tragedies. Ongoing classification of certain files, particularly those involving covert operations, foreign intelligence agencies, and classified national security concerns, indicates that there may still be elements of these stories that are being kept hidden from the public. For conclusion and what's next? What the evidence suggests were these acts of lone gunmen or coordinated efforts. The newly declassified documents provide crucial evidence for understanding the circumstances surrounding the assassinations of President John F. Kennedy, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, and Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Despite years of investigation and speculation, the question of whether these acts were the result of lone gunmen or coordinated conspiracies remains a subject of intense debate. 1. The assassination of JFK, a lone gunman or conspiracy. The official narrative, which still holds that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone in assassinating President Kennedy on November 22, 1963, has been challenged by many over the years. The newly declassified documents add complexity to this theory. Oswald's ties to intelligence agencies. Some of the declassified records reveal that Oswald had been monitored by CIA agents before the assassination, specifically during his time in Mexico and his alleged ties to Cuban and Soviet agents. These documents suggest that Oswald may have had connections to intelligence operations, making it less likely that he was simply a lone gunman. Mafia connections. Evidence linking Jack Ruby, the man who killed Oswald, to organized crime adds another layer of intrigue. Ruby's ties to the Mafia raise questions about whether Oswald was part of a larger plot orchestrated by criminal syndicates who sought to silence him before he could provide further information. Multiple gunman theory. Several witness reports, as well as certain declassified intelligence reports, indicate the possibility of multiple shooters. The documents mention discrepancies in ballistic evidence and witness testimonies, hinting that Oswald may not have acted alone, or at the very least, may have been part of a broader conspiracy. 2. RFK's assassination, a political motive or a larger conspiracy. The assassination of Robert F. Kennedy on June 5, 1968, after he won the California primary, has also been a subject of controversy. Officially, Sirhan Sirhan was arrested and convicted for the crime, but the declassified documents open new avenues of speculation. Sirhan's motive. The newly declassified records show that Sirhan had been motivated by RFK's pro-Israel stance. However, the documents also reveal strange inconsistencies in Sirhan's actions and suggest that he might have been influenced by external factors. Some records hint at the possibility that Sirhan may have been manipulated or brainwashed, with certain intelligence agencies potentially playing a role in shaping his actions. CIA mind control experiments. The declassified documents bring to light the CIA's MKUltra program, which involved mind control experiments. Some theorists believe that Sirhan might have been a victim of these experiments, which could explain his apparent lack of clear motive and disjointed behavior before and after the shooting. Witness testimonies and evidence of multiple shooters. Just like with JFK's assassination, some witness testimonies, along with declassified documents, suggest the possibility of more than one gunman in the RFK assassination. Several reports mention hearing shots coming from different directions, which fuels the theory of a coordinated effort to eliminate RFK. 3. Milk's assassination. Was James Earl Ray the only culprit? The assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on April 4, 1968, is another high-profile case where the lone gunman theory has been questioned. James Earl Ray, who was arrested and convicted for the murder, may have been involved, but new evidence from the declassified documents raises suspicions of a broader conspiracy. Ray's alleged involvement. Ray's story has always been murky, with conflicting accounts about his motives and his actions leading up to the assassination. The declassified documents suggest that Ray might not have been acting alone, and that he may have been manipulated or influenced by individuals with a vested interest in silencing King. Government involvement. Several records point to government surveillance of Milk, especially by the FBI, which had a long history of attempting to discredit and undermine King's civil rights movement. This opens the possibility that factions within the government may have played a role in orchestrating the assassination or at least facilitating it. Documents hint at covert operations that could have targeted King, adding fuel to the theory of a larger conspiracy. Potential third-party involvement. Evidence found in the declassified records suggests that the Mafia or other interest groups who felt threatened by King's push for civil rights and social justice could have had a hand in planning or financing the murder. This idea is bolstered by the fact that certain figures in the South were vocal about their desire to see King silenced. What questions still remain unanswered? Despite the wealth of information released through the declassification process, several critical questions remain unanswered. Were the key players in the intelligence agencies CIA, FBI, and other government actors directly involved in these assassinations or merely complicit in covering them up? What role did the Mafia play in the murders of JFK and RFK? Were they acting alone, or did they have assistance from other parties with political motivations? What additional evidence might be concealed in the redacted sections of the declassified documents? Were Oswald, Sirhan, and Ray the only individuals involved, or were they part of a larger conspiracy with orchestrators and co-conspirators still unidentified? Did the military-industrial complex or foreign interests have a hand in orchestrating the assassinations of JFK and RFK, given their opposition to certain policies? These unanswered questions continue to fuel debates and conspiracy theories, and they will likely persist until further information is released or new evidence emerges. What should we look for in future document releases? As more documents are gradually declassified, there are specific areas where we might expect to find new information. Further details on government surveillance and involvement. We should look for additional records on CIA operations, especially relating to Oswald, as well as any FBI files that might indicate direct involvement or suppression of evidence during investigations. Connections between intelligence agencies and organized crime. Future releases may reveal more about the potential coordination between the CIA, FBI, and the Mafia, especially in relation to JFK's policies and RFK's anti-Mafia stance. Cover UPS and missing evidence. We should look for more comprehensive explanations for the missing files, particularly those that may link government officials to these high-profile assassinations. MKUltra and mind control operations. New documents could reveal the full extent of the CIA's MKUltra program, which may have influenced Sirhan's actions and could provide more insight into the potential manipulation behind the killings of RFK and Milk. Witness testimonies and alternate theories. Declassified documents could include new witness testimonies or recordings that challenge the official lone gunman narrative, particularly for JFK and RFK's assassinations, where multiple shooter theories persist.